Chapter 15 shouldn't have been a surprise to you. Chapter 15 was looked at sexuality, right? Specifically about queer Black people, and how that particular blend of attributes tosses you in one of the hardest, most oppressed minorities that there are. I have a way to be able to show you that. In a couple of weeks, we're going to do Transgender Day of Remembrance. I want you to look at the list of the people we're going to honor that day. We're going to remember. So let me share my screen.
I've always been one that stood up for one of those on
absolutely.
Transgender Day.
So if you'd like to call Nancy Stevenson, because look how many people we have to honor that day.
Yeah, I saw that. It was a lot.
It's 40 names.
Wow.
40 names.
Wow, it's gone up since you sent the first message out then. Wow.
Yeah. So
I have a question.
Yes.
Are all of these names people who have been murdered, or are they people who have died from COVID, or?
No, murdered.
Yeah, let me tell you, there's a couple of different things that I'm going to show you. Like this particular lady right here,
no, it says,
she probably died of natural causes, but she is she's a homeless lady who was essentially left out in the cold. She'd been given space a lot, but because of that. So we've got a couple of leaders that we're honoring that way. Like Henrietta here is also, she's a 79-year-old who did die of COVID, but longtime advocate for the transgender world, right? This man right here committed suicide because of what was going on. So it wasn't a murder so much as a caused death, if I can say it that way. Okay. This lady down at the bottom, Monica, that's the one I told you about a couple of weeks ago. Very strong leader in the trans community. And there's one other one that I wanted to show you about. Oh, Lorena Borjas. She worked in a Burger King, right? And her boss would not let her take time off because she was sick. And so she worked there until she was so sick that she could not get well.
Oh my.
And probably because of that also infected other employees. So did the boss kill her? Not completely, but accomplice too, for sure. So I've added a couple of different ones like that, but most of them, yes, were murdered in one way or another. Some oftentimes gruesomely, just gruesomely. So all of that is just ways of being able to say that sexuality, especially if we can say it, the non-conforming sexuality, makes it very easy for these folks to be a target. So I love the way that he very strongly came out in this section and said, if I'm going to be for Black people, I have to, if I think that Black lives matter, I have to believe that all Black lives matter.
I agree.
And that I have to stand for these folks. And very strong statement that way. And so he talked a lot about how to be queer anti-racist is to understand the privileges of, and began to list the different things. That even cisgender, which I think we all identify as cisgender, how easy is it for us to just assume that not feeling out of place in your body is the norm, that because I feel like a male and I was born a male, that's the only normal there is. But it means more than just dealing with our own stuff. It also means having to work into doing something. Okay, you've been very involved in making sure that some of the barriers that were placed in front of HIV patients, for example, were removed. And we've done all kinds of things like that where we made good medicine should not be there shouldn't be a barrier to good medicine for anyone. And yet, when you started that work, there was, purely because of their sexuality as a whole, wouldn't you say? Yeah. So what are the barriers that you still see in this area? What still needs to be done? Well, besides the whole Methodist Church thing.
Yeah. There is that.
There is that.
Oh,
Well, transgender people in the prison system are a major challenge, because usually what you do when people enter jail or prison is drop your doors, and what you have is where you go.
Yeah.
And so if you have a penis, you go to the men's, and if you have a vagina or no penis, you go to the women's. But then many transgender women who've been living that way for years and years and years find themselves in the men's prison.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been an incredible challenge. And then I read in today's paper another challenge, and this one has me a little puzzled, and that is transgender women athletes are sometimes being outlawed from sports
Right.
as women, because they often still have the male body strength.
Yeah.
And that's greater than a woman's. And that one's a hard one for me.
That is a hard one, because there is some advantage to be discerned in that. And is it an unfair advantage, or I don't know,
well, even probably been at least 20 years ago, there were complaints on international competitions that some of the Soviet women were actually men. And, it's a hard thing to deal with, but there is such a range in each person's natural body between them and someone else's that it's hard to say that men always have the advantage.
That is true.
If the man is 7 feet tall, he is going to have an advantage playing basketball. But
doesn't be given much an advantage in gymnastics.
No.
Hmm.
So, I mean, there's advantages from body types regardless of the person's, I don't know how to say that, the sex that they're born with without sounding like a prig. But there is such a range of body types with among all of us that it's hard to say that one has an advantage. But it is a troubling thing because all things being equal, men usually are stronger than women.
Mhm.
So let me first of all say this. Typically what we say is the gender assigned at birth.
Which is a lot of words.
It is a lot of words, but that's typically what we say, just to kind of to say that's what it was, and then we figure it out from there. The
Which
hard part
may be incorrect too, because some people were assigned a gender at birth that was because they had ambiguous genitals. They just assigned it, and then
That's
were
right.
later found not to be that.
But that's why it's said that way, so that it's not a judgment of it, whether it was right or wrong. It's just what somebody said.
Yes,
That's what they were
assigned.
given.
It was called a hermaphrodite, where you have both genitalia.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I had one of those women in the prison system. And again, when she came in, she'd never had sex corrective surgery. But when in a minute. She dropped her drawers. She still had a small penis, so they put her in the men's, and she made all sorts of whoops and hollers. And I looked back at her medical record and found out she was born with both as a hermaphrodite.
Yeah.
Her parents, because she had a penis, raised her at the beginning as a boy. And even though they knew she was a hermaphrodite. And then when she was like 12 or 13, she started having periods and she was a boy.
Yeah.
So they had her uterus and ovaries removed. And then when she was around 16 or 15 or 16 or 17, somewhere around there, she realized she was a she and that she let go of the male image their parents were raising and became a she all the rest of the time then. But her ovaries and uterus had been removed and she still had a small penis. And so it was an incredible challenge for me as the medical director to decide about this woman. I mean, she is the one that was transgender that I did send to the women's prison.
Okay.
But all the rest of them I couldn't because of the laws in Hawaii
Yeah.
were such a challenge as to what to do with these women. As a doctor to them, I always wanted to make sure they were safe in the men's prison because I was afraid that they might be at risk because they were like women, in the men's prison.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things you said earlier too, Kay, reminded me that the same type of issues that happen in prison also happen along the border, and transgender people that are trying to cross, or homosexual people that are trying to cross often come up against very difficult times, especially if we put them into a detention center where who knows what happens. So the question is how do we make sure that as we're doing the advocacy that we do, that we continue to be very inclusive in our advocacy, and like the man said, affirm that all Black lives or all lives matter, and to work hard at that. I think it was interesting as he talked about the two ladies at the end. He said they were the darkness that scared me, but they're also the darkness that absolutely changed him. And you can see in this chapter how much he said, look who I am today because of what these two ladies meant to me.
I loved the way that they challenged him.
Yeah.
Because they didn't say what you thought they were going to say. I thought it was remarkable that they had this insight and could pass it on to him and felt that he was worth passing it on to, actually.
And I guess that part of the issue then is for us is to be that same kind of voice in the life of other people. Right? And you don't have to do it for every single person. But how do you be the voice that says, I see something more in you than whatever bigotry you're currently exhibiting? Because they're not going to see it as bigotry. That's why I kind of hesitate to use that word. But how do you help people to continually step towards the next space? And who do you know that you're kind of a mentor, challenger to? How are you helping somebody open their eyes a little bit more? And I don't mean that in any kind of a negative way, like that they're horrible. It's that they're just still growing and learning, which is good.
Well, I think you've all learned by now, 3 different men living with me from Africa who are asylum seekers. And the first one was M.A. And from Rwanda, and he lived with me for 1.5 years. Deo from Burundi lived with me for 3 months. And now Richard is with me from Uganda, and he's been here 4 months and is still here. They all were educated men, so not the stereotype, but all evangelical Christians. Richard is a Baptist minister, the one who's with me now. Dale was a missionary and established an orphanage in his home country. And MA was actually an interpreter for the United Nations because he was fluent in 6 languages. But it was very much of a challenge for all 3 of them to face living with me, who's such an open, flaming liberal, when they're very conservative evangelical Christians. And the gayness area was one of the biggest challenges, I would say, for them. But they all approached it very differently. MA even went, I was on the committee for the Pride service, the Tucson Pride service, for a couple of years. And MA went to that Pride service early on in his stay and didn't even believe one of the speakers, who was a man, but a transgender man, but, you know, beard, deep voice, you know, looked 100% male. He couldn't believe that guy was transgender, you know.
Right.
But he moved along that path of understanding the difference between gender identity and sexual attraction, and really understood more and more how God created people that way. Whereas Dale has not moved an inch. And I said one time, he's found a church, a local church here in town that he goes to. And I said one time, well, all of these gay people and transgender people both are, we're talking about gay people mostly at that time, are welcome at St. Francis. I said, they wouldn't be welcome at your church. He said, oh, yes, they'd be welcome. And then we teach them the right way, you know. And I thought, oh my God.
Yeah.
And then Richard, who's living with me now, very first morning he was here, he hadn't even been here 24 hours yet, harvested with his Kashida. And the place we harvested that day was a mobile home community. And it was run, the manager of the community is a lesbian with a wife. And he's become very close friends with them and works for them now pretty much full time.
Yeah.
And it's just ironic, and he can't believe it either, that the first challenge he's had is to understand more about sexual identity and so forth. And it's just been really neat watching these 3 guys move along this path in very different ways.
Nice. And I think that's what we all have to do. It's funny because you'd think that people wouldn't have to have such a huge thing on changing someone else, and yet we definitely do. Much of our discussions, I hope you've noticed, come around where we're essentially trying to take Black people and turn them into white people.
Mhm.
Set aside your culture, set aside your language, set aside whatever it is, and become this. And that's not much different than trying to say, I know the genders, it's male and female, and you're this and not that. But in all of that, it's the struggle of how do we realize what it is we don't have to change?
Well, it was interesting again with Richard, who's living with me now, because in his first couple of months, now he's found a church home.
I'm going to
But
go
for
get
several
the door
months-
real fast. I'll be right back. Probably a delivery.
But the first time, but for the first 2 or 3 months, he sat in my living room and went to St. Francis online with me every Sunday. And then when he learned that the trio, or the duo, I was telling Jim, Lisa and Diane, were a lesbian couple, and that Raleigh was a gay man, and you know, all of these people that were leaders and activists were, and he just was astounded by that, but didn't judge, wasn't judging. And that was what was so wonderful about it, is that the example that he was seeing every Sunday was very definitely an inclusive example.
So when he saw all of those people, he still decided to go to a different church. Well, I guess you said he was already a
The
minister.
Baptist minister,
Yeah.
yeah. So that was fine with me. I mean, I was glad when people started inviting him to visit other churches. Although he really liked coming to our St. Francis online service every Sunday. He didn't ever miss that. But now he's going to another Christian community church of some sort. It's not even a Baptist one, but somebody invited him, and they're meeting in person, but with social distancing, and he's finding that, and they have a Bible study, and so he's being at home with that.
So I think part of the reason why we do all those kinds of things and why we slip back is because that's what's comfortable. He goes to something that that doesn't challenge him as much. I think that's pretty typical of us. The problem is that really gets in the way when you get to the next chapter. And this chapter challenged me a lot because it essentially said, think about what you're doing. And if it hasn't worked, do something different.
Get rid of it. It is not working. You know, we all laugh at that phrase about if you keep doing the same thing over and over and it doesn't do any good, you know, that there's something wrong with what you're doing. And yet this is exactly what we're doing in the civil rights area.
That's right. That's right. My granddaddy used to say, if you think like you thought, you get what you got.
I love it. I love it. I love it.
And yet it's so hard because you think that it means, you know, that these things should happen. There's a premium I have in all cases to try to interrelate with a person and help that person to move and change, just like I just said in the last chapter. And yet his whole point is this. He's not saying you don't do that so much as he's saying, if you really want to affect change, you have to change policy first, because policy changes groups, and then change individuals after.
Yes.
That is a remarkable chapter, really. I mean, as far as the fact that unless once you get the policy changed, even with all the grumbling and screaming and yelling and everything else, for the most part, people fall into line. Now, that hasn't necessarily happened with the Affordable Care Act, but
but it has to a very real degree. Here's what people have said. You know, I've seen people post this on Facebook, for example. Yeah, I'm going to kind of put a concise definition on, but we'll say something like, I'm against the Affordable Care Act, but I'm against Obamacare, but I sure like my insurance from the Affordable Care Act.
Yeah, right, right.
Right?
that disconnect.
It's that disconnect. That's exactly right. You put the negative on somewhere, but you say, but the benefits of this is something we needed to have. So I posted something on Facebook just this week that said that support for same-sex unions is the highest it's ever been, at 70%.
I know, I read that. Isn't that amazing?
Right?
And then look who got appointed to the Supreme Court today,
right.
or yesterday.
Mm-hmm. And so here we have this that had been such a, you know, if we go back, what, 10 years?
Hardly even that.
It was probably 30%, 20%, less, I don't know. And so in a relatively very short time, that has switched, partially because Supreme Court said it's legal, right? And I love the one section in here where they said that the people who are fighting stuff will say something's going to happen, knowing full well that it's not going to happen, but they use that to try to scare people into staying.
Oh yes, oh yes.
Right, and that was definitely true about same-sex marriage. They said it'll destroy your marriage. I heard that phrase so often, it just drove me crazy. And it's like, it legalized. We had a slew of same-sex marriages, and guess what didn't happen?
You're still married?
What?
You're still married?
That's funny.
And it's like, how do we?
You know, when the people say destroy regular marriages, I kept saying, but how?
How? How's it going to do that?
I thought one of the most outstanding things that happened in the past week was the Pope's declaration of acknowledging civil unions for gay couples.
What an incredible thing.
I thought that was a middle of the road, amazing move on his part.
But unfortunately, half of his parish priests have denounced him.
Yeah.
But that's okay, and maybe it causes a split in in the
In the
Catholic
Catholic
Church at
Church.
some point.
Yeah.
But the
Can you
reality
imagine
is,
a church being split
yeah,
Well done.
here's the thing, all of that stuff that we think is going to
over
happen
gayness?
typically won't happen. But like you said, what if racist ideas make people illogical? Right? He asked that question. And I think that's the type of thing. Well, I think it's going to do this. Well, yeah, is there any proof? Is there any reason why you think that? Is there any logic to it?
But Jim, that's the problem. Most people aren't concerned about whether their beliefs are logical or not.
That's exactly right.
Mhm.
And especially if there's people, and I don't want to throw too much shade on my profession, but in many of these cases, it's people of that are in religious positions of authority that are saying, this is the way we have to do it.
Yeah.
We have to be against gay marriage because we have to.
Well, and then they cite some obscure biblical passage to confirm their illogic. You know, they know that in their heart of hearts that they're not really being logical, but they have to find something that, you know, you're going against the Bible. And
Yeah. Here's my thing. Even if the passages in the Bible are correct and they are truly against, I don't want to fight that battle any longer.
no,
Let's just say that
it's not worth it.
biblical passages say it's against the Bible. The question is never that. It's that people say, and God's the same yesterday, today, and forever. And it's like, I'm not certain that that's what's meant, because there's all kinds of things that we have changed our view on
Oh, yeah.
as we've moved forward, as we've evolved religiously,
Yes.
Yeah.
right? And you're just holding on to that because you want to not move.
That's right. And it's that specific area that you're holding on to when other areas you're much more flexible about.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
Right.
And we've all moved, we've all changed, all religions have changed. Okay. One of the things, I'll get right to you. Let's see. One of the things, like if we're talking about Catholics again, in that last big split in Catholicism, right? The 500 years ago, Martin Luther stood up, said these things, and off went the Protestants,
Yeah.
forging a new path. Now, what was remarkable about that is it wasn't just that Protestantism suddenly went and became the right religion. Catholicism also, because of that moment and that questioning and that struggle that went through there, it became one of the best eras of their own Reformation, and they became a much better church afterwards. And so I believe that's what's going to happen in the midst of all this as well, is we'll figure out what are some new directions, some new ways of being that we haven't thought about before. Because we often get into those places of not changing because we don't want to think. And suddenly something like this forces us to think. Leticia.
You and I have talked about this too, when you're talking about God this and God, it's not static. We've talked about, if you really study the Bible, you study theology, you know that the Bible is written in layers. And it's written in layers for children to understand it, for adults to understand it, and to help us move through an evolution. It's just so many people get stuck on their own interpretation that they refuse to believe that continually reading it as we evolve as a person, we find those layers. And as far as Catholicism, the Jesuit sect of Catholicism are the keepers of the wisdom, right? Keepers of the mysticism. General Catholics won't talk about mysticism because they don't teach that to the laity. But the last time I looked at the Jesuits, almost 90% of them are now practicing Buddhists as well.
Mm.
So it's changing the flavor of the Catholic Church, because Ratzinger was a Jesuit. They're the ones that drive the church's intellectual changes. So you're seeing it there too. The Pentecostal movement within the Catholic Church is amazing right now too.
So a lot of what we have to look at is what can we change and how can we change? And he's pretty clear about what he thinks has to happen. You have to work on policy.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
We have to be involved in legislature, in Senate and House of Representatives. We have to be involved in the politics of our space, right? And if we're not in the space of making sure that right policy happens.
Mhm.
So how are you involved that way?
Well, I'm just ashamed to say that I'm involved mostly in just voting.
And what did you say?
In just voting.
Oh,
You know, I talk to people, but they're people who have basically the same ideas that I have. But one of the things that this election is making very clear to me is that we need to start working again. You know, when George Bush stole the election from Gore, I was with a group of people from the Founder United Methodist Church and others in Washington, D.C., who had a counter march to the inaugural and felt really involved. So when I read his description about between demonstrations, the difference between a demonstration and
Protest.
protest, I thought, wow,
Yeah.
you know, you don't even think about how they are so different, and how one is really activity, and the other is just making noise.
Well, but he wasn't completely putting down demonstrations. He was.
No, he wasn't.
He came back and he gave a reason for that. It does help us to be able to collect ourselves together and
it also helps if it affects someone's pocketbook.
That's right. Get resources and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
Not everyone's going to be involved in the protest for one reason or another, but the demonstrations allow a lot of people to begin that process.
Mm-hmm.
But then we've got to make sure that that's not the end of the process.
Yes.
I think that's his point.
I think really, I mean, the biggest part of this has got to be about money.
Yeah.
And about who is supporting what. And when you find out what company is supporting what we would consider to be a wrong stance, that's when we have to start making noise about those companies and maybe doing something else. But really, money is the sword of politics right now.
Yeah, it is. You're right.
And I think part of it is this, Pam, too. It's not just an uncoordinated effort. The protests he's talking about are very coordinated efforts.
Yes.
And very, so that they are the most effective tool possible. And it could be a boycott of certain things.
Yes.
Right. But it also has to be a very pointed, very loud, in your face, not in the face necessarily of a person, but in the face of society that says we will not allow this to be true any longer.
Yes.
You have to decide how to do that. For Martin Luther King, it was supporting Rosa Parks and the others who did not ride the bus, and setting up all the stuff around them that allowed them to continue to be able to function in the midst of not being able to have that tool that helped them so well, right? Yeah. They set up ride sharing programs and whatnot to be able to make that happen. And it was months.
Months, yes.
And we have to know that this type of thing will take persistence and endurance.
Yeah.
Yes.
Over the years, the way I've affected the change, and was developing personal relationships with state and local legislators and stuff like that, where I was able to have one-on-one debates with them
Wow.
to see another course rather than them trying to sort through protests and demonstrations, right? And actually engage them and you know, they're well trained, they're well rehearsed at avoiding answers to the press, avoiding answers or pulling themselves away from the protesters where they're not even having to have those discussions with the general public anymore. So years ago, once I started developing those relationships, worked somewhat from the inside,
Yeah.
I guess, or to where we're at a dinner party and we get the whole family involved in these debates.
That's right.
And it also helped in the areas that I was working, bridge that divide. And you know how you guys know how I always talk about we got to find the common ground. And it's a lot easier to do that if Jim's able to do that to a certain degree because of his position. But there's other ways for the rest of us to do that. Kind of come in on the side doors. My first introductions were through chambers of commerce. And then from there, just developing the relationships allowed me to continue and dive deeper.
And I think you're right that's exactly it. We need to work on getting very close to our elected officials. Regina is an amazing woman, very progressive woman in leading our city right now. We need to see, can we meet with her or have her come out and speak with us on a regular basis? She would do that, I think.
Can you answer a question for me about Regina? Is she from Arizona or is she from someplace else?
Born in Somerton.
Oh, okay.
Just south of Yuma. So she was actually probably born at Yuma Regional, but Somerton is where she grew up. So, Ann Kirkpatrick has at least part of her heart at St. Francis. We need to develop that so that she continues to feel a connection to us. She was with us a year ago at Christmas. Those are the types of relationships we need to nourish. Go ahead, Pam.
There are just so many areas that areas of inequality, education, jobs, housing, healthcare, that it seems overwhelming. But I'm wondering if, as a church or another organization or a group or whatever, if you just pick one of those areas to work on and to talk with the elected officials that are involved with that, making small steps. And I think that's a problem. And I've said it before in our church services, Jim, that there's some days that even though I don't read the news commonly, I feel overwhelmed.
And here's, I think you've got it exactly right though, Pam. No one of us can solve all the issues that are there. Right?
Nor can our one church solve all those issues.
Nor can our one church solve it. But there's ways that you can do that. So PCIC is a great vehicle for that, right? And it doesn't mean you have to be involved deeply into PCIC, but you do need to figure out who is there so that you can support them. So for us, for example, June is one of our leading forces in PCIC. We need to support her and find enough people that will be on that team that we have a good, strong voice in that arena, because that's one of the basic places where we have they do regular trips up to the legislature to visit with people. So that's a place where we need to work, right? So if you want to be part of that team, that's a great thing. But also figure out, go to June and say, June, how do we help? Right?
And look at what the other churches are doing. Look at what the Catholic Church is doing. They're pretty damn good at feeding people and taking care of the homeless.
That's right.
And
They are.
support them so that we and other churches can gravitate to what they do best, what we do best.
So that's one of the other things to do is where is it that you connect up with other churches? That's one of the reasons why I was involved in PCIC a lot, so that I knew other leaders from other churches. Southern Border Coalition, our SBCC. I started going there because I felt it's about, SBCC is about border ministries all along the southern border. And I started going there so that they would see St. Francis present at that meeting. And I've been able to move back a little bit because now Scott's taken a lead role on that.
Mm.
Okay.
So where does all of this fit in with making policy changes though, unless we are involved with our legislators? I mean, we can join these groups that are actually helpful, but if, as he says, the real change comes with policy,
That's right.
that's the more difficult thing to do.
Yeah, it's let me talk about SBCC, for example, with that. So SBCC is one of the places that will go and set up meetings with Border Patrol. We'll organize counter protests against some of the things that Border Patrol are doing or not doing. It's that type of thing where we can have some effective change. All right. These, you want to find, I like how he defined activist groups or activist individuals, that these are the people who make policy changes. So you don't want to just get together in a group that's a support group.
Yeah.
Right? Oh, poor us. Right? You want to get together with a group that actually somehow helps change both us and for sure the stuff around us that are doing something. So SBCC is, I love them because they're doing important stuff, right? PCIC the same way. We will meet with on a regular basis our representatives, and we get to have a voice in their lives because of that. So part of what you have to figure out is what groups are you involved in that are working to change policy, and it can be at whatever level, right? Think about your neighborhood. And if there's something that's not happening right in your neighborhood, in whatever way, what do you set up to change it? Go ahead.
I mentioned that I've got a group of people after me to join or to run for TUSD school board. Probably won't really hard consider it until the next round of elections, maybe the year after. But I want to do my homework. I want to know that the challenges that are there. I know I have a 30-year history on an ancillary position. Who else at St. Francis is looking at stepping forward locally, Jim?
Dylan and Annie.
And where St. Francis can help us, you were talking about, we got school district issues, we got different issues. Don't forget to look inside.
Yeah. One of
and,
the,
and throw your support and your contacts at us so that we can grow to be the best candidates that we can be.
yeah. One of the ways that I got to know Dylan and Annie really well is because we spent several hours sitting at a protest, not a protest so much as it was a school board meeting where there was a big organized group, we think from a church up in the East Valley, up in Phoenix area, that had come down to protest the sex education program,
Oh, good Lord.
right, at of TUSD.
Yeah.
And so there's people who are strongly will take some strong roles that way, but it helps if everyone knows each other. So it's not, one thing about protests is they're organized, not just random,
Yeah.
not just each person speaking up where they speak up, but that we work together to make that speaking up the most effective possible, right? So to do that, you've got to identify your group, you got to identify your issues, and you got to identify your action.
You also have to identify like that group that came down. A lot of times they bombard.
You do.
And again, it bars us as a community to have a conversation,
Yeah,
Mhm.
especially when they're coming from outside of our community.
Yeah.
yeah,
And if we're not having some kind of, if we don't pull this polarization of ideals a little bit closer together,
yeah.
Mhm.
we're not getting the assistance of those people in the middle that are going,
Right.
Yeah.
But part of what you're talking about there, Leticia, is a word that sometimes we shy from, and that's the word power. Because we've too often seen power be the club by which somebody beats somebody else up.
Yeah.
And power is the ability to affect change, right? And it doesn't have to be because somebody loses. It's because we somehow wield that power in such a way that what needs to happen happens. And it's very often in coming together. At one point, he said in there that sometimes it's convincing the people in power that this is to their advantage.
I think that's very effective if it can be carried out.
well, that's what I use the personal debates for.
Yeah, but you've got to figure out what are some of those advantages that you can exploit, to use a word that sometimes is a little divisive, but you can exploit what it is that other person needs in order to bring something else forward.
Another word for that's bribery.
Bribery.
And
I mean, really, it is. If
but
you're
beyond
showing them the things that they want,
Yeah.
well, they will get from moving over here. That is sort of bribery.
It is
But
sort of.
beyond that, when you're talking about ethnic groups, it's breaking the stereotypes and focusing on for those people in power. Say, drop the stereotypes. Here's what our strengths are, and I'll take you into the community and show you it in action.
Yeah.
And that's where I fight within the minorities, and where I've said that there's a whole bunch of people of color saying, don't talk to me about racism. Don't use the racism word, because I'm not going to engage you. As soon as I engage you, you win. Right? As soon as you approach me with racism, rather what we do is, hey, this is nothing. This is 1 millimeter of dead skin.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if you can't come to me with ideas, I got to go find people that will talk ideas with me.
Well, and what you're talking about, though, is part of the power you have to find is who else is on your side. What are the coalitions you make? And you have to be really careful, because you your first instinct might say, who is exactly like me and has all the same purposes as I do? And it's not that. You find somebody who is on the same space as you are in this issue. And you amass those forces together to get this issue together. And we have the groups that have more things in common, and we're longer term groups or whatever. But you have to not expect that power means sameness. Go ahead.
An example of that, when I was gone for 20 years. There's people in the Hispanic community that were young kids when I left that are now leadership. But they align themselves with Jim Click.
Yeah.
And Jim Click is exploiting them, and they don't see it.
Yeah.
Rather than going within the community. Now, there's an interesting thing about Vietnam with the Hispano-Latino community, also with the Native American communities. Per capita, they had the highest volunteerism. And they lost the most men.
Mhm.
And in that, if you think about leadership, they tend to step forward first. We had a generation in both the Native American, Hispano, Latino communities where they lost a generation of leadership.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is the level that I work within when I have the opportunity to work with the Hispanic community, is to get them out of the oppressed idea or the victim idea and give them the power to voice that they do have strength and they do have an ability other than picking fruit in the fields.
That's right. But that's always the challenge. That's what power is about getting enough people who embrace an idea, who embrace a cause, that you have the ability to affect that change, right? And the reality is the more we're isolated from each other, the more we think we do not have that type of power, right? Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, one of the things that they did best of all is they said, you, lowly field worker, have power, not in and of yourself so much as us together, right? And allowed them to see a voice that they hadn't seen before.
I've talked about this too, Jim. I don't look at Cesar Chavez or Martin Luther King as ethnic activists. They were human rights activists because in the field they were taking care of every color.
That's right. And that's part of what we have to figure out, is how to say, in Tucson today, in Arizona today, what is it that we need to have? It bugs me, for example, why it is that education becomes a dualistic position. Mm-hmm. All Republicans have to and all Democrats have to. No, we all believe in educating our children. Mm-hmm. Right? So how do we take that, I want my kid educated, and put us into some kind of coalition that allows us to change what we're doing in education in Arizona, or any other topic that's there? What do we do to not be against each other, but find the common ground that allows us to move forward? That's power. That's what that is. Yes.
And the way I say this to minorities is, for every child that is not held up to the same standards and given the same opportunity, no matter what color is, we're doing ourselves an injustice, because eventually we need them to take care of us. Mm-hmm. We not us physically, but us community. Mm-hmm. And by not educating them, they're not prepared for that. Mm-hmm. Right. And this idea, I've told you the story about this idea that it's just the Hispanics, it's just the minorities that are failing, and it's a person of color issue. No, it's not.
It's not.
You know that, Jim. It's not. But it's been said so long that the minorities say there's no way we can overcome this because they've proven it, which they really haven't.
Right. Well, but what you have to do is start saying the next narrative. And again, the difference between protest and demonstration is protest is very short term. It's done with. It's easy to get volunteers for it. And the protest, you have to work hard. You have to maintain that energy over a long period of time. And not everyone's going to do it.
Yeah.
For that amount of time.
Protests aren't always public.
Protests aren't always public. That's right.
Yeah.
But it's an ongoing effort that has to be done. And we have to decide, how do we do that? But it has to be continually more than just let's get ourselves incensed. It has to be, how do we make that incensement, if that's a word, how do we make that anger change things?
Yeah.
Right? How do we turn it into an action that actually moves?
Right.
And we used to laugh about the art gang thing. Let's put on or Rooney and Garland movies where let's put on a show. And sometimes that's how we address this. We're going to do a protest. We're going to do a demonstration. Let's put on a show, and then we go home.
Yeah. And here's the thing about that. And I think you said very clearly that show is not a bad thing, because part of what you're doing is you're saying to these folks that you know aren't going to be with you in 3 months, give me a bunch of your money, give me a bunch of your effort for a few seconds, so that then we can use that to sustain what is a longer effort than what you're going to give to it. Does that make
Then
sense?
we have to follow through.
But then you have to continue to follow through, because what you won't have is all of those people with you the whole way through. But we have to care about it enough that we continue to move and do something with it.
The good thing, though, about the demonstrators is that at least their hearts are with you as you carry on that work.
That's right. And I'm not downplaying the demonstrators. That's not necessarily a bad thing. But you have to, hopefully they know that I'm going to come back in 6 months and ask you for money again, or I'm going to come back and ask you to sign another piece of paper in 3 months, or whatever it happens to be. They may not be there every minute of it, but you develop them as the people that you continue to get support from.
That's what I see PCIC has done well.
Uh-huh.
And to be able, and
coalition, broad.
And that's also a place, a resource for us, not just PCIC as an organization, but for us to go and say, how did you put this together?
Well,
what's your processes?
The good news is Joe Rubio, who is our lead organizer, Joe and I have been friends for 20 years, and he would come and talk to us that way. He would.
And that's where my strength is I network.
Yeah.
And I do it very well. Unfortunately, I started getting involved with y'all before COVID, right before COVID.
Yeah, that's the hard part.
So I'm playing catch up with y'all.
Yeah. But the hard part is that much of the legislative work is going to go on, COVID or not. Right?
No, I meant more involvement with the community, not necessarily.
Yeah.
I've already told you, I talk to everybody and anybody I can. So I'm doing a lot of stuff that nobody knows about.
All right. So it's the end of our time together. There's lots of work to be done, but really think about these things and see what do we do to move forward? There's been several names I've tossed out at you that will be good names. That some others that you might think about are Diane Everhart, who is now the chair of the IN Project.
Oh,
down at the U of A campus. They are continuing to look at what does that morph into as we've gotten less and less folks. There's lots of good ways to be able to do things. So what we have to figure out is how we coalesce to make it happen.
Mhm.
We also have a little thing, I kind of made a joke about it, but in 10 months, the Methodist Church is going to decide what to do.
Yeah.
And so there'll be a bit of work around all of that.
Yeah.
Right? And how do we become the next phase of Methodism, whatever that is? Because whether we stay together or we split into two denominations, it's the next phase.
Yeah.
It will not be the same as it was. So, all right.
Yep.
Thank you for your time today. I have a bit of sad news. Next week is our last week.
Oh,
We have our
yeah,
two,
that's
we have to
right.
finish the book.
We'll
yeah,
be
we
out
have
of
our two last
chapters.
chapters for next week.
Yeah,
So,
okay.
well, because you've got to solve all the issues by next week.
Okay.
So Jim, where are we going after this class?
I'm going to take a couple weeks off during this hour, and then we're going to do a short Lenten series using Maya Angelou's poems and looking at that coming together for Christmas. Because one of the things I love about Christmas this year is how many feel like you need to be rebirthed a little bit? You're ready to have something new emerge from all of this. And I think that's kind of what
You
we're
mean
gonna,
something good, not something
yeah,
new.
something good. That's right. Yeah. How do we have a good birth in all of this? Because we've
Got
done,
mine early. I'm happy.
yeah, we've done enough of the pregnancy and the labor. Let's,
Yeah.
Labor pains, yes.
all right. So that's kind of where that conversation is going to begin. And celebration team is doing a lot of stuff to try to say, how do we begin to, like, we're going to try to do some live short services, not in person, but on Zoom, to be able to have some conversations and some singing together in some ways, some things that
Almost done.
begin to bring some of the normal back in. And it's not quite where we get to be normal, but we're closer.
All right. See
All
you
right.
all next week.
See you in a week.
Take care.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
Good night. Goodbye.
Bye.